Right now, some of the deepest tensions between the Western and Islamic worlds trace back to a series of wars that started over 900 years ago. Between 1095 and 1291, European Christians launched 9 major military campaigns to capture Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. We call them the Crusades, and they killed millions, bankrupted kingdoms, and created wounds that still haven't fully healed. But what if Pope Urban II never gave that speech in 1095? What if the Crusades never happened at all? Today, we're exploring how different our world would be without 2 centuries of religious warfare. Let's start with what actually happened. In November 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont, France, and delivered one of history's most consequential speeches. He called on Christian warriors to march east, liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule, and protect Christian pilgrims. He promised spiritual rewards, forgiveness of sins, and glory. The crowd erupted with chants of Deus Vult, God wills it. Within months, tens of thousands of Europeans were marching toward the Holy Land. By 1099, they'd captured Jerusalem in a brutal siege that killed thousands of Muslims and Jews. For the next 2 centuries, Crusader kingdoms controlled parts of the Middle East, while Muslim forces fought to reclaim them. The fighting was savage, the casualties were enormous, and the hatred it generated lasted centuries. But in our alternate timeline, Pope Urban II makes a different choice in 1095. Maybe he's more focused on internal church reform. Maybe the Byzantine emperor's plea for military help against the Turks gets ignored. It doesn't matter how. The point is the Crusades never launch. European knights stay home, Jerusalem remains under Muslim control, and 2 civilizations that were about to collide violently continue on separate paths. So what happens next? First, let's talk about what doesn't happen. There's no massacre in Jerusalem in 1099. The thriving Jewish and Muslim communities that existed there continue living their lives. The cosmopolitan, relatively tolerant culture that had developed under Muslim rule persists. Jews, Christians, and Muslims share the city as they had for centuries, with the usual tensions but without apocalyptic warfare. The Islamic world develops differently without the trauma of invasion. In our timeline, the Crusades united fractured Muslim kingdoms against a common enemy. Saladin became a hero by recapturing Jerusalem. The concept of jihad as armed struggle got reinforced and weaponized. But in this timeline, without that external threat, Islamic civilization continues its golden age uninterrupted. Baghdad remains the intellectual center of the world through the 12th and 13th centuries. Muslim scholars keep advancing mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy without the disruption of constant warfare. The House of Wisdom continues its work. Translation of Greek texts into Arabic accelerates. When the Mongols eventually invade in 1258, they encounter an even more advanced Islamic civilization. Now here's where it gets really interesting: Europe. In our world, the Crusades had massive consequences for European development. Nobles bankrupted themselves, funding expeditions. Younger sons who would normally have no inheritance went east seeking fortune. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa became rich, transporting crusaders and trading with the East. But without the Crusades, European development slows down significantly. There's no massive wealth transfer to Italian merchants. Venice remains a regional power instead of becoming a Mediterranean superpower. The commercial revolution that transformed medieval Europe happens decades later, or doesn't happen at all. European contact with Islamic learning is also delayed. In our timeline, Crusaders brought back Arabic texts on mathematics, medicine, and science. European scholars in Crusader kingdoms translated Arabic works that preserved ancient Greek knowledge. This flood of information helped trigger the Renaissance. Without the Crusades forcing this cultural exchange, European intellectual development crawls at a slower pace. The technology transfer matters too. Europeans learned about advanced military technology from Muslims during the Crusades. Better castle designs, new siege weapons, sophisticated logistics. Without that forced education through warfare, European military technology lags behind. When the Mongols reach Eastern Europe in the 1240s, they face less organized resistance. But here's the big one: religious tolerance. The Crusades poisoned Christian-Muslim relations for centuries. They created a narrative of inevitable conflict between civilizations. They established patterns of viewing the other side as existential enemies rather than potential partners. Without that trauma, interfaith relations developed
They are
very
well.
differently.
Thank you for
Jewish
asking.
communities in Europe faced less persecution. In our timeline, crusaders massacred Jews on their way to the Holy Land, and the crusading mentality fueled anti-Semitic violence for generations. Without crusades, European Jews still faced discrimination. Medieval Europe was hardly enlightened, but they avoid some of the worst pogroms. Spain's Reconquista plays out differently. In our world, the Crusades gave Spanish Christian kingdoms a template and justification for their campaigns against Muslim territories. Without that model, the Reconquista is less ideologically driven, more about territorial expansion than religious conquest. When Granada finally falls in 1492, there's less religious fervor behind the expulsion of Muslims and Jews. The Ottoman Empire's relationship with Europe changes fundamentally. In our timeline, the Ottomans were partly responding to crusader aggression when they expanded into Europe. The narrative was partly about revenge, about pushing back against Christian invasions. Without that history, Ottoman expansion is purely strategic, not ideological. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 might not even happen. If you're finding this fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We explore these alternate history scenarios every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's jump to the modern era. How does 2025 look in this timeline? The Middle East is unrecognizable. Without the deep historical grievance of crusader invasion, Western intervention in the region faces different opposition. When oil is discovered in the 20th century, when colonial powers carve up the Ottoman Empire, the resistance movements don't have centuries of invasion to reference. Terms like crusader don't carry the same poisonous weight in political rhetoric. That doesn't mean everything is peaceful. Colonialism still happens, resources still get exploited, and conflicts still emerge. But they're economic and political conflicts, not civilizational ones. The narrative of ancient Christian-Muslim warfare doesn't exist to inflame modern tensions. European identity develops differently too. In our world, the Crusades helped forge a common European Christian identity. Fighting Muslims in the Holy Land was one of the few things that united French, German, English, and Italian nobles. Without that shared project, European unity comes slower. The concept of Christendom as a unified civilization is weaker. The Renaissance probably still happens, but it arrives later and looks different. Greek and Roman learning still gets rediscovered, but through slower trade contact with the Islamic world rather than through the forced exchange of the Crusades. European art, architecture, and science advance on a delayed timeline. Here's the crucial question: is this world better? Millions of people who died in Crusader warfare and its aftermath live full lives. Jewish communities avoid some of Europe's worst persecutions. The Islamic Golden Age lasts longer. Christian-Muslim relations don't carry the same historical baggage. But Europe develops more slowly. The commercial revolution is delayed. The intellectual flowering that came from forced contact with Islamic learning happens later. European power projection, for better or worse, is weaker going into the colonial era. It's a world with less religious violence, but also less dynamic exchange between civilizations. Sometimes conflict, as horrible as it is, accelerates change. The Crusades were a catastrophe, but they also forced two worlds to collide, mix, and transform each other. All because one pope decided not to give a speech calling for holy war. One decision, one moment in 1095, and the next 1,000 years of history completely transforms. The Crusades weren't inevitable. They were a choice. And in another timeline, that choice was never made. What do you think? Would this world be better without the Crusades? Or did something valuable emerge from that terrible conflict? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into alternate history, smash that like button and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. We've got more mind-bending scenarios coming your way, so stay tuned.